In the early 1800s, a private company commanded an army of around 250,000 men. Not a nation, not a king, a business. That force was twice the size of the entire British Army at the time. From a room of shareholders in London, this company ruled land thousands of miles away, and at its height, it governed a fifth of the human race. So here is the question that should stop you cold. How does a trading company that started out selling cloth and spices end up owning one of the richest civilizations on Earth? Because the answer is not what you think. It was not won by better soldiers. It was not won by a great general on a horse. It was won by something far quieter and far more powerful. It was won by money, and by understanding a truth about power that most people never grasped their entire lives. Go back to the beginning. The year is 1600. Queen Elizabeth I grants a royal charter to a group of London merchants. On paper, it is nothing special, just permission to trade in the East for spices, silk, cotton, and later, tea. That is all they are. Traders chasing a profit. For the first century and a half, that is all they do. They build trading posts, they ship goods, they make their shareholders rich. Nobody looking at these merchants would ever guess they were about to swallow an empire. But while the company was busy trading, something enormous was happening across India. The Mughal Empire, which had ruled the subcontinent for centuries and had once been the wealthiest empire on the face of the earth, was falling apart. Its emperors were weak. Its governors were carving out their own little kingdoms. The center could not hold. And when a great power collapses, it does not leave an empty space. It leaves a vacuum. And a vacuum is the most tempting thing in the world to anyone with ambition. And the means to fill it. Here is the part people get wrong. The company did not do this alone. And anyone who tells you one clever Englishman conquered India is lying to you. This only worked because the Mughal Empire was already breaking from within. It only worked because Indian bankers financed it, because Indian soldiers filled its ranks, and because ambitious Indian rulers made deals with it to beat their own rivals. The company was not some unstoppable force of nature. It was an opportunist, and it understood the rules of money better than anyone else at the table. The company saw that vacuum, and in 1757, at a place called Plassey, in the rich province of Bengal, everything changed. Now, if this were an ordinary History Channel, I would tell you about a glorious battle. I would tell you how the company's commander, Robert Clive, outfought a much larger Indian army against impossible odds. But that is not what happened, and the truth is far more revealing. Clive did not win Plassey with swords. He won it with a bribe. Before a single shot was fired, he had already made a secret deal with the enemy's own commander, a man named Mir Jafar, promising him the throne of Bengal if he simply refused to fight. And behind that deal stood money. The richest bankers in India, a family known as the Jagat Seths, threw their weight and their fortune behind the plot. So on the day of the battle, most of the Nawab's army, the army that was supposed to crush the company, simply stood there and did nothing. The battle was not fought. It was purchased. Clive walked onto that field already knowing he had won, because he had bought the outcome before he ever arrived. Think about the picture for a moment. On paper, it should have been a slaughter. Clive had around 3,000 men. The Nawab of Bengal marched out with something close to 50,000, with cavalry and cannon. By every rule of war, the company should have been crushed into the mud. And yet, within an afternoon, it was over, and the giant army melted away. Because the men at the front had already been paid to lose. This is the first hard lesson of the whole story. a battle can be decided long before anyone reaches the field, in a quiet room, with a bag of silver and a promise. The soldiers were just the theater. The deal was the real war, and the company had already won it. Now, most people think that was the prize, the battle, the victory. But they are wrong. Winning Plassey was not the real move. It was just the setup for the real move, the one that turned a trading company into a superpower. Because 8 years later, in 1765, the company forced the weakened Mughal emperor to hand over something that seems boring on the surface, but was in truth the master key to the entire subcontinent. They call it the Diwani. In plain terms, it was the right to collect the taxes of Bengal, the right to collect the land revenue of India's single richest province, home to tens of millions of people. Stop and think about what that actually means. Before this, the company had to ship silver from Britain to buy Indian goods. They were spending their own money. But now? Now they controlled the tax base of Bengal itself. And here is where the genius, the cold and terrible genius of the whole thing reveals itself. The company took the tax money it collected from the people of India, and it used that money to pay for an Indian army, an army of local soldiers, trained and armed by the company, used to conquer even more of India. Do you see the machine they had just built? The conquered were now paying for their own conquest. Indian taxes funded Indian soldiers who seized Indian land, which produced more Indian taxes, which funded more soldiers, which seized more land. It was a self-feeding engine of empire. Picture the clerks in Calcutta, ink drying on the ledgers, columns of numbers that would soon become muskets and marching orders. Once it started turning, it did not need Britain to keep pouring in money anymore. It paid for itself. It grew on its own, and that is why it grew so fast and so unstoppably. And it did something even more clever than that. The company left the old system of government largely in place on the surface. Indian officials still sat in their offices. The Mughal emperor still wore his crown and kept his title. To the ordinary person, it could look like nothing had really changed. But underneath, the company now held the one thing that actually mattered. It held the purse. It let others keep the appearance of power, while it quietly took the substance of it. And that is a move you will see repeated all through history, and in boardrooms today. The smartest players do not always grab the crown. They grab the treasury. And they let someone else keep wearing the crown as a decoration. This is the lever. This is the hidden mechanism behind the whole story. And it is the lesson I want to burn into your mind. Real power was never the sword. Real power is the thing that pays for the sword. Anybody can raise an army for a day. The man or the company that controls the cash flow can raise an army forever. The company understood that sovereignty, the right to rule, is not some sacred thing handed down from heaven. In their hands, it became an asset. Something you could buy, if you controlled the money and you controlled the guns to protect it. And the numbers show just how far that machine could run. By the early 1800s, the company's private army had swelled to around 260,000 men. Let that sink in. A private business commanded a fighting force twice the size of the standing army of Great Britain. There were nations, real nations with kings and flags, that could not field a force like that. but a company could. Because a company had done the one thing that matters most. It had seized the flow of money, and it had turned that flow into muscle. And here is the warning built into all of it. A machine that answers only to profit and that has an army to enforce its will is a terrifying thing. Under company rule, Bengal, one of the richest regions on earth, was squeezed so hard for revenue that it suffered a catastrophic famine. Millions died, while the company kept collecting its taxes. This was power with no conscience attached to it, power that existed for one purpose only: to pay its shareholders. And in the end, it grew so out of control, and its abuses grew so severe, that a massive rebellion erupted in 1857, and the British Crown itself finally stepped in and took the whole thing over. The monster had grown too big even for the empire that made it. So what is the lesson if you want to understand how the world really works? The East India Company did not beat India in a fair fight. It never intended to. It bought the outcome at Plassey. It seized the right to tax Bengal. Then, it turned that money into the army that took the rest. The decision was made in quiet rooms and counting houses, long before it ever reached a battlefield. The sword is what you are shown. The treasury is what decides who gets to hold it. And a company that learned to buy the treasury did not need to be a country to rule like one.